My name is Hassan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 73, which is going to be a short episode today. We're going to talk about, very briefly, a book that we are going to cover more in depth later on a future podcast episode, The Power of the Powerless by Vaclav Havel. So I want to introduce the book a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about the background of the book. Actually, not really the background of the book. I want to talk a little bit about the background of the UAW in the United States and the labor movement, particularly as it relates to progressivism and the current state of societal overreach that we have in America. The Power of the Powerless is an essay written in the 1960s by Vaclav Havel, born in October of 1936, and he died in December of 2011. He was a Czech statesman, author, poet, playwright, and an anti-communist dissident who observed the true heart of communism and the power of ideas in a way that Milan Kundera, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and other dissident writers saw in his time in Eastern Europe. Now, Havel wrote plays, essays, and memoirs and contributed greatly overall to the development of Czech literature during the course of his lifetime. And he went to jail for it as a political prisoner. His longest term was for 4 years, between 1979 and 1983. Now, personally, I always used to confuse Vaclav Havel with his fellow dissident contemporary, the Polish Lech Wałęsa, with whom he shared the distinction of being arrested by communists for daring to open his mouth. Now let's switch a little bit. That's a little bit about Vaclav Havel and a little bit about the background of the power, or what constructs the background of power of the powerless. So let's switch a little bit and let's talk about what constitutes a dissident posture in a culture. So the socialist movements of the United States peaked in the 1920s with the rise of the UAW and the impressive cultural power of the disciples of the progressive movement, the political progressive movement in America. Now, political, social, and cultural progressivism came into the forefront of American culture with the political mix that included the trauma of the American Civil War, the ambition of Western manifest destiny, and the religious fervor of the Second Great Awakening in the early 19th century. Primarily defined by the idea that the past is an irrelevancy, that scientific rationalism can solve all problems through bureaucratic management of less intelligent masses, and that utopia can happen just over the horizon and without an appeal to God, progressivism has won the day in our time, almost 100 years later, of the government and the overall societal popular culture of the United States. Now, there are those who disagree with this idea, but what they forget is that while the Socialist Political Party, led by Eugene Debs in the 1920s, may have failed to win any traction at the ballot box, almost all of the Socialist Political Party's policies have been instituted to a lesser or greater degree by the Democrat Party, starting from Franklin Roosevelt all the way to now. By the way, in case you don't believe me, an article in the American History of Socialism from their website states the following, and I quote, "Another way to gauge the influence of socialism in U.S. history is to list some of the prominent American writers, artists, intellectuals, activists, and scientists who either publicly embraced the label or favored a socialist blueprint for the nation. It's quite a distinguished roster. At various times it has included Ralph Waldo Emerson, Walter Lippmann, John Dewey, Charles and Mary Beard, W.E.B. Du Bois, Jack London, Carl Sandburg, Upton Sinclair, Theodore Dreiser, Helen Keller, John Reed, Eugene O'Neill, Randolph Bourne, Florence Kelley, Isadora Duncan, Thorstein Veblen, Walter Rauschenbusch, Clarence Darrow, Max Eastman, George Bellows, John Sloan, Charlie Chaplin, Ernest Hemingway, John Steinbeck, Orson Welles, Norman Mailer, Woody Guthrie, and Jacob Lawrence. Two of the most influential labor leaders in U.S. history, Walter Reuther and A. Philip Randolph, were also open about their sympathy for socialism. So at some point in their lives were Margaret Sanger, Betty Friedan, and Gloria Steinem, a trio who did much to create the modern feminist movement. Several of these people remain controversial today." Close quote. So, What could possibly constitute a dissident posture? What possibly could Vaclav Havel, a committed socialist, though not a communist, what possibly could Vaclav Havel's Power of the Powerless tell or give to a time such as ours, in a nation such as ours, whose little people are fundamentally conservative in their bent, but who are being ruled by people who are fundamentally utopian in their worldview? Well, here's an idea. It used to be, back in the day, that a lot of people worked for and were employed by labor unions. Now, we don't talk a lot about Labor Day on the podcast because, well, quite frankly, there's very few well-written books about labor. But the United Auto Workers, which was founded as part of the Congress of Industrial Organizations in the 1930s, was the primary leader, along with the American Federation of Labor. That was the primary entity that drove labor unions in this country in the 1930s all the way through the 1970s. Now, its most influential president, the one who had sympathies for socialism, Walter Reuther, ensured that the Democrat Party in America really took the UAW under its wing, particularly during the long period of economic growth between 1946 and 1970. Reuther managed to leverage unions in the United States against corporations, effectively holding down executive salaries, ensuring a lack of millionaires and billionaires, blunting economic globalization of labor, and effectively ensuring that minorities and women stayed out of the unionized workplace. But that white males, making sure that white males were actually able to work and pay for their families' lives. And by the way in which he typically did this was this. The UAW delivered contracts for his membership through negotiation. Reuther would pick one of the big three automakers, and if it did not offer concessions, he would strike it and let the other two absorb its sales. Kind of a clever way of pulling that off. But Reuther and many other union organizations in the 1970s didn't foresee the coming of globalization and the expansion of capital markets that allowed for economic growth in the 1980s and 90s, and of course precipitated the decline in union membership. Don't get me wrong, unions are still around, but they're nowhere near as powerful as they were in the halcyon days between 1930 and 1970. On Labor Day, a holiday designed to commemorate the Haymarket Riot of 1886, we tend to merely think of Labor Day as another day off, as many people no longer work in union-led organizations or industries, nor are mass strikes a current part of the American economic, political, and social landscape, as they continue to be currently in Europe, where labor unions have a lot of power, and as they were in the larger cities of America, particularly Chicago, New York, Boston, between the 1880s and the 1930s. So what does all this have to do with Power of the Powerless? Well, Power of the Powerless is fundamentally about one question. Why does a greengrocer put up a Workers of the World Unite poster in his window? What does it take to be a dissident in a culture that is driven by a predominant political position? What does it take to be a dissident in a culture where the entertainment, the social life, the governmental life, and even the governmenting life, the regulatory life that you live under, where that life is increasingly driven towards socialist ends that you may not fully see or comprehend, nor that you may fully agree with? How does a greengrocer, a small business owner, a kulak, such as it were, how does that person survive in a system that is designed to actually either push him or her into a corner or totally grind them down? Well, one of the big points of the Power of the Powerless is not to live by lies. When the greengrocer puts up the sign, Workers of the World Unite, in order to sell a few more peaches, he's actually contributing to the larger lies of the culture. He's not just putting up a sign. He's not just making a statement. He's contributing to the overall degradation of the moment. Look, the challenge of our time and the challenge of a dissident in any culture where certain tendencies are dominant, the challenge is to fight those tendencies. The challenge is to basically blunt them, to make them less powerful. Freedom of association, which is also what Havel was worried about, is more than just about worship or speech. It's about social sanctioning and social norming, particularly in our day at the level of clicks and attention. Havel was also concerned about being true to conscience and how much that was more important than speaking truth to power. The story of Jonah here, if you're a biblical person, is probably beneficial for you to read or think about at this point. Now, the larger point that Havel would make, and I think the UAW would disagree with him on this, or maybe they would agree, is that as our technological prowess in the West increases, our need to live by truth also increases summarily. And if we're not doing it, then we might as well all put up Workers of the World Unite signs in our windows and just be done with it already. And well, that's it for me. Thank you for listening and subscribing to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. If you're listening to this on any of the major podcast players, like iTunes, Google Podcasts, or Spotify, please go ahead and leave us a 5-star review and write a little bit in there. A couple of sentences is good enough. That actually helps us game those algorithms that I was just maybe addressing. And, of course, it helps us grow the show. Tell all your family, tell all your friends, and tell the leaders in your life that you know that need to be listening to this show that this show exists. By the way, if you want to get started on the leadership path yourself, or you know some people who need to go on the leadership path, HSCT Publishing, the home company of Leadership Toolbox and Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, can help you and your team do that. So check out our training webinars, coaching services, and more at leadershiptoolbox.us. We are remote, we're live, we're in person, we're on video, and we've got leadership development solutions for your civic group, nonprofit staff, public sector staff, or even your private sector leaders. And of course, you're going to want to check out our video-based subscription service at leadingkeys.com. That's leadingkeys.com for leadership development on demand. You don't like videos, you don't like training, but you really like the podcast? Well, I would also recommend reading a book. Matter of fact, I'd recommend reading my most recent book, 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership. You can get that in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Ingram Spark, and any other place that you order books online. Finally, of course, we're on YouTube just like everybody else is. We'd love to have you help us grow the YouTube channel, so like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the HSCT Publishing channel on YouTube. Just search for HSCT Publishing, or you can search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button. Subscribing helps us grow the show, as it does with the audio, just is the same with the video. All right, that's it for me.